Good day, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Together Ensemble conference side event dubbed SDG Teaching Community of Practice. This session is a collegial roundtable to share experiences and innovations in teaching the Sustainable Development Goals across Canada. We are very honored that you have taken time to participate in this event, which promises to be insightful and engaging. My name is Ajwa Apia, a PhD student at the University of Waterloo School of Environment, Enterprise and Development. I'll be co-moderating this session with my colleague Blessing, whom I'll be handing over to shortly introduce herself and the esteemed chair for this event. We kindly request that you post your comments and questions in the chat box available. Thank you and enjoy the session. Over to you, Blessing.
Thank you, Ajwa. My name is Blessing Ajayi, and I'm a doctoral candidate in sustainability management at the University of Waterloo. I am honored to be one of the moderators for this session, and I hope you enjoy everything that we have planned for you. It is my honor to introduce the chair of this session, Professor Marie-Claire Kodoni-Segre. Professor Marie-Claire Kodoni-Segre is Liberum Trust Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge. She also serves as Senior Director of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law and a full professor of law for the University of Waterloo in Canada. She teaches the SDGs at the University of Cambridge as well as the University of Waterloo. She has published 22 books and over 140 papers on globalization, sustainability, and the law in 6 languages, and has served as senior legal counsel and expert for the United Nations and other treaty bodies, and is laureate of the Justitia Fundamentum Regnorum and the Romantry International Justice Awards, among the other distinctions. Over to you, Marie-Claire.
Thank you very much, and warmest thanks especially to Adjoa and to Blessing, who have really been the organizers of this session. I think we are very much hoping that both of them decide to become professors themselves and join us in the teaching community of practice, but we're also aware that they are going to get many other offers, so we're going to have to do the best we possibly can to convince them and persuade them that teaching in this area is as exciting as possible. I'm very, very pleased that so many people have signed up for this, and I'm looking forward to the session greatly. As you know, as part of the Sustainable Development network, as the part of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in particular, we actually have a community of practice that shares ideas and often also support and engagement and even sometimes curriculum and syllabi among different professors who teach sustainable development goals in their classrooms. And so today's session, brief though it will be, is essentially an opportunity to have a bit of a roundtable to share some of the ways that we've been teaching the SDGs and to also engage with others in this conference who would like to learn more or suggest other solutions or exchange ideas. So the session is meant as a collegial roundtable dialogue to exchange experiences and share innovations in teaching the SDGs across Canada. And what we've asked is that in particular, as a beginning of our roundtable, some of those colleagues who are teaching sustainable development goals and part of the community practice could give us 3 ideas in 3 minutes. So we know this is a 45-minute session altogether, and we want as much interaction with them and with you as humanly possible. So what we've asked them to do in particular is to give us 1 top SDG teaching resource that is assigned on their syllabus, which students appreciate and find useful. And then the second idea is 1 top SDG teaching methods innovation that they have found works well. And then finally, if they would be able to, in their 3 ideas in 3 minutes, give us 1 top SDG teaching assignment that their students enjoy. We have some pretty amazing people from all across the country who have accepted that challenge and are joining us here online today. As a way of introduction, I will introduce each of them in turn just before it is their turn to talk. But what I would like to just recognize, of course, is that we're joined especially by Dr. John Boakye Dankwa, who's a course instructor at McMaster University, Kathleen Kevani, who's an associate professor at Dalhousie University, Houston Peschel, who's Haskell teaching fellow and senior instructor at the University of Calgary, Jody Rebeck, who is an assistant professor at Algoma University, and Brock Dickinson, who is family hold back from Ottawa, from the University of Waterloo itself, and he is our entrepreneur in residence. And so they are going to be kindly helping us to start off. I think I had promised to give as an example my 3 ideas in 3 minutes, and I'll do my best. In terms of just a resource that I always include in my syllabus, I think I'll be boring and simply say, obviously, the text of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. So, you know, towards 2030, the agenda itself. And I usually do that with the link, the hot link to the actual Sustainable Development Goals website of the UN, because I find that often the information there is much more up to date than simply looking at the goals themselves. In terms of one SDG teaching methods innovation that I found worked well, in our class, we do use an interactive method. And so our students will sign up to take one of the mandatory readings and present them to the class at the beginning of the class. And this allows them to get a handle on at least one set of readings per term, and usually many more of them. But what we also do is we have an expert review panel. Because they are in a Masters of Development practice, I want them to have some practice in being thrust into a situation over which they have very little control and being ready to respond on the spot the way that lawyers do. And so what they do is they join a hypothetical expert review panel, and it is their job after the readings have been presented to ask 3 to 5 discussion questions that the whole class has to answer together. So obviously they're listening very carefully during the presentations, and they try to come up with good discussion questions for the class. And of course, what I found is that the students who are in the class are much happier to discuss discussion questions that their own colleagues have come up with than me putting them on the spot and sort of firing a machine gun of questions at them. So it's a way of including and interacting and valuing everyone's experience. Finally, last but not least, 3 in 3 minutes, one top teaching assignment. They form task teams. They decide on a jurisdiction, and they try to figure out how they would actually implement at least 2 targets of 2 SDGs in their project. And what I find, of course, in that assignment, which is one of the reasons they seem to enjoy it, they do a certainly brilliant job every time, is that they are struggling to actually see how the SDGs can be implemented in practice, and they have to work with some of the real world problems that you would run into. So it's no longer, oh, I wish this included that, or, oh, but that really ought to have also said something about this, and rather, how do I make this real on the ground? And I love seeing that transition from theory to practice. So I'll leave that as it is and introduce Dr. John Boakye Dakwa, who is one of our first speakers, and I understand he is not yet here online. So Karim has stepped in and is willing to represent him. We're just going through a couple of tiny changes. Karim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Kanwar. I'm actually Dr. Boakye Dankwa's instructional assistant. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it today. I think he's feeling a little bit under the weather. So I'll just be presenting his short three points in 3 minutes here today. And if you can just give me 1 second.
Thank you very, very much. That's absolutely brilliant.
Awesome. Okay, so I do have a little bit of a script, so just bear with me, it won't be as informal. So my name is Kanwar Karim, and I'm a instructional assistant within McMaster University's Academic Sustainability Programs Office. I've developed and continue to help develop a 2nd-year course called Exploring the UN SDGs. The UN changed the way we define, action, and report on sustainability and the SDGs, and our need to know information in all sectors. We teach this need to know information to our students in ways that are effective and fun. So I'll tell you a short story about my students from last semester. After being introduced to the SDGs, each student selected one SDG that they were most interested in learning about. One group selected SDG 2, No Hunger. One of the things our students need to know is how the SDGs interact at a global scale, and we teach them this through virtual simulations and games. The entire class engaged in a virtual simulation where they acted as leaders of different countries, and here the students in our story got to experience the challenges of trade-offs and finding various synergies in an unequitable world. The student group noticed how certain countries were dealing with food waste while others were dealing with widespread hunger. And the simulation method was a teaching method that really worked well with us because it's highly engaging and it sparked interest within our students. And so transitioning on to identifying the SDGs in the real world, students turned their attention to McMaster University, and we asked them to identify policies and practices that either advance or hinder our progress towards the SDGs. And so one student group in particular found that our on-campus food bank and related processes to that were advancing SDGs 2 and 3. To help students understand the SDGs at a more practical level and to help them be more successful in their task of identifying the SDGs, we introduced them to the SDG targets and indicators. This information is free and accessible to a lay audience and is one of our top SDG resources and one that they one they can continue to refer to once they're done the course. And so the last thing our students really need to know is how to develop new ideas and advance the SDGs in a manner that is applicable. So getting creative, students were encouraged to develop new ideas and propose potential partnerships to bring their ideas to life. Our students pitched ideas to a panel of university decision makers. And our student group from the story mentioned earlier pitched the idea of a community fridge in our campus. A community fridge is a fridge and pantry located in a public setting that makes food available to anyone who needs it at any time. The assignment to pitch their ideas to the university decision makers was an assignment that our students enjoy because they know their ideas have potential, they're valuable, and they themselves have the agency to influence sustainable change. And so just in summary, our students need to know how to understand the interactions of the SDGs at a global scale. So we play a virtual simulation. They need to know how to identify them in the real world. So we look around McMaster University for examples. And we need to know how to action change. So we let them get creative with their ideas and provide a platform to share them with people who can bring their ideas to life. And just as a side note, since pitching to decision makers, a new cohort of students worked with McMaster University's community partners and engaged over 20 departments in McMaster University's governance to establish the very first community fridge. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kunwar Karim. And thanks especially to McMaster for sharing these topics. We are very honored and pleased to also have Professor Kathleen Kivani, Associate Professor at Dalhousie University, to share in 3 minutes her 3 ideas on these 3 topics.
What a privilege to be among such esteemed colleagues. Thank you for this opportunity, and my kudos to the team for organizing. You do have a bright future ahead. We'll like to get you at our university as well. I'm calling in today from Delaware Nation in southwestern Ontario, although I'm seated in unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people who have been welcoming us and stewarding for millennia that we join in this work with them. So before I introduce our students to the Government of Canada's Data Hub on Sustainable Development Goals, my jump off point is the wonderful video called Leave No One Behind, Global Goals. And it's a video by Civicus, Project Everyone and Development Initiatives. Students really like it because it personalizes the issues and it makes the pressures feel real. And it helps ignite, I think, a desire to do something. And they can see themselves and potential friends in the beautiful faces in the video. And students like the powerful music and the images. And the message is clear and uncomplicated. Everyone deserves to be well. Everyone is included. All count and all will be counted. Every life matters. And it is less than 4 minutes of focused attention. And it can really, in our work, launch us into helpful conversations and further take up actions in one's own life, but also, of course, in the process of our course. But like our colleagues in Hamilton, we want to make this real in their lives as well. So one of the methods that we use, somewhat innovating in our teaching, is to do role play. So we use scenarios to help students develop greater empathy and a sense of agency, again, like our colleagues already mentioned. And I use an explanation to say the disparity in development from the global north to the global south can be compared to the global south being hit by a devastating flood, then a drought, then a vast fire, and then they have to contend with foreign governments dumping cheap rice in their country, and then they also have to face a contagious disease all in the span of 6 months. How can they keep up? So one teaching method that we use is that they are to work well in asking students to imagine themselves as the CEO, the Chief Energy Orchestrator, where students are invited to imagine that they are in a specific country where they're helping local leaders with the design of an initiative to improve the area. And they use information from the video, from handouts on the SDGs, and of course the SDG website, to answer what would they work on, what actions would they take, and what recommendations would they make? What resources might they need, and who else might they need to connect with? And how might they address local challenges from the perspective of local leadership in a global context that particularly addresses decolonization and anti-racism? And then for one of our teaching assignments for the students, whether they enjoy or not, I don't know, I get a sense they do, but from the exercise, the students will be required in the course also to do service. So in the community, they apply these ideas. So in the course, they take up some component of the SDGs, and they also look for hands-on experience in our community. So I teach elements of social change in this course, and we discuss social, environmental, economic, and political factors, and the ways these can be leverage points and power interventions, and how can they make a positive contribution, and what are the indicators that the students themselves would use for showing signs of progress and social change. So they have to ask themselves, if they are a recipient to any of the strategies that they had in mind, would they agree to them? Does it seem fair and reasonable and appropriate? So they join individual students with classmates, and they build on their individual service component to devise together a social change strategy. And each group is to bring forward ideas so that they're workable, inclusive, and enjoyable solutions. So that's our strategy. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I think it's fascinating that so many of us are using experiential techniques. Possibly it lends itself well to the SDGs. I'm going to go right over to Houston Peschel from the University of Calgary. Houston.
Thank you very much. So this course is called Strategies for Sustainable Development, and it's offered to our undergrads as a senior elective, our MBAs as an elective, and then our executive MBAs. So I teach all three of those. And the way we kind of incorporate this this learning opportunity is through agriculture, our food system. I'm quite passionate about the food system. I'm part of the CDL Creative Destruction Lab as a moderator in the ag tech, and think our food system is a great way to learn a lot about sustainability. So the resource that I use was actually created by the Manitoba Council in International Cooperation. It's called Sustainable Foundations, a guide for teaching sustainable development goals. And I'm going to put it in the chat. Why I like it so much is because it's very, very manageable and digestible for somebody who's coming to this for the first time. And they've set up every goal with what are the targets, what are the kind of learning objectives, they have curriculum connections. They have these couple of big questions around it that I find spur a lot of conversation, and I teach this course online. And so I do a lot of breakout rooms with this reading, and they have to go and read through this. I assign one goal to each group. So, poverty, no poverty gets a group gets that goal, and then they have to go in and read through it. And there's some case studies at the end. They read through those small case studies, and then they've got to go find an organization that is creating meaningful impact on that goal, and then present it to the class. And specifically, I'm trying to show them about the depth of the targets, of how, how it's not just about poverty, but there's these very refined targets below, and try and find companies that are doing a good job transitioning to increasing their impact on a specific goal. And then they come back into the main room and share each of those companies and what they learned about that. And so there's a lot of kind of aha moments from the students on that. So that's kind of an experiential exercise and a reading that I use. As far as an assignment goes, their major team project, it's 40% of their grade, is to find a low performing agriculture company that's rated on, say, MSCI or Sustainalytics and has a very low score on their sustainability. And they have to go in and do a full strategic analysis. Specifically, one of the major components of the rubric is to assess them on where they're at with their SDGs using the natural step framework. And then they have to find out using backcasting to find what their future state should be and strategically how that organization should create change in order to create more meaningful impact across whichever SDGs they decide to assign. So, and that turns into a 10-minute video that they create for the class as well as myself to mark. And then finally, kind of another resource we've created is I've received a grant for teaching and learning to go into the community around Alberta and find local companies that are making meaningful impact on all the SDGs. Because I think one of the challenges we hear from our students is that this is all about developing, outside of Canada. This isn't impacting us as much. So I found that comes up a lot in class. And so what I went and did was I found a company for each of the SDGs that was local and smaller, or run by, I collaborated with Indigenous Works to find local Indigenous examples as well, and made a 10-minute case study of that using a CBC documentary filmmaker named Eric Gonzalez. And so these are the kind of awareness of our local economy and the power that our local economy has on the SDGs. And so this course has actually transitioned into now a mandatory course for all first years. We just passed it by council, and I'm converting it on my sabbatical this year to be a mandatory course for all 800 first years, so that they will all be able to get the UN SDGs and kind of this idea of sustainability, not just as an elective. I will finish off there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Houston, if you're able to put links to a few of those different resources and programs in the chat, I think you're inspiring everybody, as was Kathleen and Kunwar. So I'm going to turn now to Brock Dickinson from the University of Waterloo, and he's got 3 minutes and 3 ideas.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. I'm teaching a course this term on entrepreneurship and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not an academic, I'm an entrepreneur, and so this is really sort of coming from a different perspective. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to sort of try to attach our concerns about the challenges around the SDGs to entrepreneurship as a potential tool for addressing some of those challenges. So in terms of some of the resources, this wasn't really a field where we saw a lot of established literature or a lot of books or publications that we could draw on a regular basis. And so I would echo what Marie-Claire and Kunwar have both already mentioned, which is the UN's SDG website itself. One of the things that we've really found is that the students that are coming into our program, it's mostly 3rd and 4th year students, they're already familiar with the SDGs at a broad level. They know what the goals are, but they haven't necessarily been exposed to the targets behind the goals, sort of the tangible and kind of practical elements of what underpins these big ideas. And so that is probably the one resource that I would really direct people towards, is that sense of getting beneath the kind of the surface level exploration of these ideas into a lot of the more specific detail. In terms of the specific teaching methods, we're really an ideas course. We sort of dive into the origins and history of entrepreneurship, the origins and history of sustainability, and then try to connect those two. And some of that is, the storytelling of my own sort of entrepreneurial experience. I also spent about 10 years with the UN. The exposure to the sausage making of how the UN works is, I think, really interesting for students. But probably the most compelling kind of teaching innovation, I would say, is that one of the things that we have done in the course is to integrate into each class a young entrepreneur who has launched a venture related to the SDGs and is already out there in that entrepreneurial space trying to make a difference. So, for example, in our first class this year, we had a young student named Gabriel Saunders. He's from the Turks and Caicos Island, but he has been developing a bacteria that eats plastics, particularly LDPEs, and so is looking at ways of eliminating plastic waste, and has started a venture to pursue this idea. And so we're really sort of saying, yes, we want to talk about the big ideas, we want to talk about these big goals, we want to talk about the specific targets, but let's also think about the practical ways in which individuals, much like you, young entrepreneurs, recent graduate students, have been able to sort of tackle these challenges in the real world by linking entrepreneurship and a concern about targets and challenges related to the SDGs. And finally, in terms of a specific assignment, I would echo this notion of the kind of the practical applications that many others have already talked about. Fernando Reimers out of Harvard University wrote a book called Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, which is focused on the SDGs. It's primarily focused on elementary and secondary students, but it was great for me in terms of thinking about models in terms of how to kind of connect our post-secondary students into some of these practical opportunities. And one of the things that we have done is that in the major assignment that they have this term, they're tackling a target related to one of the SDGs. They have to sort of explore that target, understand the problem in a lot of detail, and begin to identify entrepreneurial solutions to that particular challenge or problem. We've encouraged them to then take that solution and bring it out to the pitch competitions that are prevalent at our universities. And in particular, the World's Challenge, which is a global competition for entrepreneurial solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals. So our students are taking what they're working on in the classroom and taking it outside the class in a way that's going to give this assignment a sort of an extended life. Once the course finishes, that World's Challenge process continues months and in some cases years into the future as they continue to work on these entrepreneurial ideas that they've had the chance to develop in the class. And so this, in a sense, gives them an exposure to the opportunities related to working on these ideas and not just learning about them in the classroom.
Thank you, Brock. And I should also mention that Brock, in addition to teaching the course on entrepreneurship, also guest lectures and appears as a special guest in, for example, my course on stakeholder engagement and partnerships. And he's been absolutely amazing in that respect. The students are always really thrilled to meet him. And it's that mix between the practical and the academic that I think often characterizes the teaching of SDGs. I've met very few students who are willing to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the massive challenges that they represent globally, and also the aspirations and the inspiration that they present, and then say, well, that's an interesting academic subject, we'll move on to the next. They do tend to certainly want to act and act fast. And the more they learn about any different SDG, no matter how passionate they become about one or the other and end up spending the rest of their lives and careers on it, the more they want to act. And that is something that we've seen. Now, adding to the excellent ideas, I'd like to open up to questions and comments from our participants who have joined us online from the Together Ensemble conference. And I do notice that everybody who has put a book or mentioned in a program, there are like 50 questions in the chat already saying, please, could you share a link to your program? Please, could you share the name of the book? Please, could you share a link to your video? And so I will encourage all of our roundtable participants to share those links on the chat. Do we have a question coming forward from the chat? Because if not, I'm going to turn back to Adjoa and Blessing to each be able to ask a question of their own. I think one thing that I would already help us to get started with while everyone's thinking about their questions who are online is just, and this is really a question for Brock and Kathleen and Houston and Kunwar, but for everyone as well. You know, one of the things we've seen is that, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are for everyone, rich or poor, developing, developed, least developed, fourth world, you know, living in a nation that is encircled by another nation due to historical or colonial or other reasons. And yet, even so, participating in the SDGs themselves, participating in the leadership work that is needed to deliver on the SDGs and the collaborative work that is needed in the SDGs, it's still uneven. There are a lot of barriers. I teach one course, which is actually an online course for empowering young women who want global careers in the SDGs. Some want to be academics, some want to be in government, some want to be entrepreneurs, some are more interested in you know, going forward and forming NGOs or protest groups or foundations. But all of them are very passionate about the SDGs. And many of them have shared barriers they've run into in trying to take on new careers in this area in their countries or globally. And so I was just wondering, do you have any advice? And I'll maybe just ask one of our roundtable participants. Do you have any advice for young women or people who face barriers, no matter what the reason? You know, how to overcome those barriers when it's not just a question of, you know, getting a career in order to make money, but it's actually a question of getting a career because you're passionately inspired by the work that you want to be doing in this area. And I will also just come back to Adjoa and Blessing, because I think there are a couple of questions now in the chat and they might have questions of their own. So I'm gonna come back to Adjoa and Blessing and ask them if they have anything they'd like to call to our attention from the chat before I turn back to our roundtable participants.
Thank you very much, Prof. Cordania Sega. We have a question about how do you go about making the link between the local and the global with respect to the SDGs? Thank you. That's the question.
Oh, I know somebody already who's given a really great example for that. And I love the idea of picking companies that are failing to integrate SDGs and then saying, hey, see if you could turn them around. So I'm going to come to Houston for that one. And then I'm going to come to maybe Brock and Kathleen, if either of you have ideas for ways that you would help people to overcome barriers. And then we'll go back to Adjoa and Blessing to share other questions from the chat. I can see a couple more there. And Kunwar, if you want to come in on either of those, please do. But Houston, on local to global?
Yeah, so I do that in two ways. One, I let the students, the very first thing, the way they introduce themselves is they do a carbon footprint analysis of their lifestyle, and we all end up with 3 to 12 Earths. And so then I turn it into like what they can do locally. And they need to look at it. And when they get into the food system, they quite quickly realize what their food decisions, their diet, where they purchase their food, where it comes from, has quite a big impact. And so I try and create some intrinsic motivation for them individually to just reflect and question, not be judged on their consumer behavior. And then to understand the power of a local economy and supporting local farmers, specifically small size farmers. And then as far as business goes, again, I teach in entrepreneurship and innovation. So I really try and drive them to innovative things that young people their age are doing. And so we have a lot of startups that have spun out of U of C in the ag sector. And so I try and bring them in and show them what graduates who maybe graduated with a finance or accounting degree, but what they've done outside of that and how passionate they are and what they're doing to create impact. And then I try and scale that up by showing them these massive companies like Tyson Foods or these like just, Cargills of the world, that, to be able to go from local to global and maintain that is quite challenging. I use Patagonia's book, or Yvon Chouinard's book, Let My People Go Surfing, just talking about, as an example, what does a kind of a tier 4 company look like? And while they're not ag, they've transitioned into ag now. And so I try and show that it is possible to scale and create meaningful impact in the UN, with the UN SDGs. So it's not just something that is small and local. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm with you on that. And I think many of us are often invited to sit on the boards of companies as your hair goes more and more gray. And one of the things that you can do on that board is ask the right questions about how that company is going to either align with the SDGs or admit that it's not useful for that agenda going forward in the world. Yeah. So local to global, as you say. Back to Kathleen and then Brock, and I do notice that whether it's a question about barriers or local to global, either would be welcome. And then there's a couple other questions in the chat that we'll come back to Blessing and Adjoa for.
I would just add to the excellent remarks already that owning power is one thing I really enjoy working on with students, is helping them become fluent in new language, and particularly young women or women of all ages who have aspirations to have a social enterprise, and positioning their work in a very powerful context and not being in any way dissuaded by some measures that they might not be looking to achieve in their company, but other ones that they are. So really pronouncing what it is they are doing rather than feeling in any way lesser than doing it just for a profit motive, for example. Although that's a driver, there's many other drivers as well. And really valorizing all of these elements and changing the context. And like Houston, things are changing. We see small scale power sources really expanding, and they are influencing in food and in other domains much more of they're receiving more of the income, and they're producing better results as they see and multiply each other's efforts. So I'm very encouraged by what I see, but certainly young folks at the forefront are some great examples like Brock had shared as well.
And that's a perfect transition across to Brock. Brock, local to global or taking down barriers?
I think local to global, and in a sense, basically building on both of those previous comments. I mean, Houston talked about the kind of the examples that individual businesses or entrepreneurs can offer up, and you know, the notion that we bring in young entrepreneurs to kind of talk about their own experiences, we're trying to bring them in from the local community as much as possible. So these are peers, these are examples of people right next door who are already sort of challenging and addressing some of these ideas. Some of those entrepreneurs are thinking big. We had two young women who started a venture called She Cycle, which was looking at sort of feminine hygiene products for East Africa. And this particular case allows us to tackle a whole series of issues around things like colonialism, North-South relations, privilege. And so we're able to kind of take these local ventures and ideas and explore a much broader set of issues that really allows us to, you know, start locally, but think globally as we start to think about the ways in which these ideas play out.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually inspired partly by Brock's work and some of the readings that he assigned to my class, a team of students from our class decided to take on street furniture in Delta, North Delta, Vancouver. And even during the pandemic, when they were opening up, because of course everything had to be done out on terraces and outdoors, they were actually starting to take back the streets and put in place, you know, activities that children could do while the mothers were shopping, or what in Canada we would call ping pong tables, so that kids could play while their parents were dining nearby in a street cafe. And it totally changed the whole neighborhood. And these students started it as a project in the class, but kept going, ended up hired by the city of Delta to actually put in place sort of millions of dollars of investment in street furniture, and literally turning around an entire neighborhood, which I think all of us who spend any time on the West Coast or grew up there would probably identify as one of the most, you know, talk about highways and strip malls kind of areas. So really making a difference. And I think it's that kind of taking the local to the global, looking at the SDGs and then thinking how you can make a difference in your own community that can also make a difference. Now, Kunmar, you were willing to come in on local to global as well?
For sure, I'll just keep it very brief. But one way we try to really emphasize the local to global is through the virtual simulations that we host. They take about 4 hours, and it gives students the opportunities to serve as like environmental ministers, social affairs ministers, and water and environment ministers for 3 virtual countries that are interconnected. And it really helps the students like visualize specific SDG indicators and understanding how advancing one SDG may hinder another. And so we try to emphasize that global interconnectedness of the SDGs. But just speaking more to actually actioning the SDGs, we try to, although we can go global because we are students, we try to take it as big as we can at McMaster University. So we try to engage as many of the university administrators as possible and give students the opportunity to just propose one unique or creative idea that they can possibly implement at McMaster.
Excellent. Thank you, Kunwar, as well. I'm going to come back to Joa and Blessing in case they've seen other good questions on the chat that they could pull forward for us. And then we'll do one last round of answers. And then I know we have to close because we have a very short amount of time, but I think we're going to close with an invitation to everybody who's watching. If you're teaching the SDGs, join the community practice. You know, I'm working on a law textbook on the SDGs right now for Oxford University Press, and I'm part of a bunch of other kind of groups of professors who get together to talk about their teaching. It astonished me that we didn't have one of these groups already in Canada for people who teach the SDGs, and I'm finding it so inspiring to meet colleagues who are innovating each in their own way, each in their own universities. So I would love to have more colleagues joining the community practice, and anyone who is listening online is very, very welcome to do so. Joa, Blessing, over to you. Do we have any more questions that we should get answered?
Yes, we have one question from Maria. Her question goes, is there a learning or teaching resource or activity that you'd suggest that can help push thinking and action beyond the SDGs? I'm thinking post SDGs towards a new global framework that will include, for example, more goals on equity, decolonization, etc.
Gosh, that's a great one. We have to achieve the SDGs and then also before lunch. So I'm going to come back. Maybe I'll go in reverse order this time, just to be fair. So Kunwar and Brock, do either of you have any ideas? And then Kathleen and Houston.
I can jump in. I don't want to cut Kunwar off, but just briefly, this is something I'm struggling with myself. So our last class this term is being devoted to the notion of what comes after 2030. And we're bringing in some folks who come from the UN discussions around the creation of the SDGs. We've got John Beale from SDSN Canada coming in to spend some time kind of really thinking about what follows on to the SDGs, and that, you know, there were the MDGs that preceded the SDGs. We're going to have something that follows them. And so how do we start to anticipate and prepare for what comes next? And yes, we hope we all achieve all 17 goals by 2030, but the reality is there's still a lot of work to be done at that stage. What does it look like, and how do we get our students ready for it? So I don't have answers, but we're definitely asking the questions.
Excellent. Kunwar?
Yeah, so we try to, just like Brock, we don't have the answers for something like that, but we try to foster some thinking within the students through some activities. So students will look to they'll have their particular SDG they're focused on throughout the semester, and then look to 2 other SDGs that they could perhaps hope to integrate into a brand new SDG. Although it is just a theoretical assignment and it's sort of a one-off, it helps students to sort of put their own personal flavor or whatever they're interested in within the SDGs and create like a pseudo SDG, if you may call it, for their own interest.
Wow, that really is thinking outside the box. It would actually be brilliant to think about what that would look like that isn't already covered in the other 17, especially. Kathleen?
Yeah, great ideas. I like to try and help students not feel like it's their responsibility alone, that this is a systemic issue and that everything requires evidence that the systems are moving ahead. So in my own work too, I'm like Marie-Claire, involved in many initiatives and really striving to be kind of the change I want to see in the world. And not that I'm utilizing my own experience, but trying to demonstrate commitment to these principles of decolonization. We don't have the answers either, but it is a shared responsibility, and the students see and take part in broader actions that they feel they can be part of and know that the system is shifting.
Absolutely. Houston, back to you, and then we're going to have to close, but I think we all want our colleague Minas, who has just posted on the chat, a chance to think about what we could do for high school students. And so we're going to have to do a second section next year at the Together Ensemble and see if we can tackle that particular question directly. Houston, over to you.
I'll go in a very different direction. I actually use this kind of question to talk about generational change in a platform called the Fourth Turning, which just talks about these major generations that we're going through, these cycles. And I bring in the world of Web 3.0, crypto, metaverse, decentralization of finance, DeFi, and these things, to just show how we are in the process. It's hard to see, but that we are in these huge generational shifts and things are changing rapidly. So I try and bring it back to some inspiration that is quite large, but really talking about how generational changes can really have a huge impact. And that's what I think when we think 2030 post is, what does a world look like where we don't have a fiat currency like the US dollar? And what does that look like? Some of it's controversial and the students like that. So it really gets this class riled up.
Well, I can imagine it does. I'm going to close with a quick example. During the pandemic, a lot of high school students were sent home, secondary students were sent home. And in some places, their schools immediately got busy. They had the resources. They could teach, not perfectly, but a little bit on Zoom or in some other online way. In others, kids were handed a textbook and told to maybe come back in September. And that was in March. So they were being given a 6-month gap in their education. And the inequalities were stark. In still other areas, people were working to help to take care of other younger children, or couldn't even join any kind of education and didn't have a textbook. So a group of students got together from around the world and contacted us here in Cambridge and also at Waterloo. And they said, look, we're representing about 800 kids online, high school students who have been left stranded by the pandemic lockdowns. And we'd like to ask if you could contact some of the most amazing professors worldwide from all different universities, all different walks of life, and ask them to spend an hour online with us, helping us to learn about their research, to learn about new directions on science, law, and sustainability, and to inspire us and give us 5 really good websites in their area that we could check on. Because a lot of the time when we try to look stuff up, we fall on pseudoscience. And I'm in year 11. How do I know that this is like not real medicine or not real, sustainability or not real law? So they were absolutely amazing, and they did form this network, and they've now formed a global youth council coming out of the pandemic together with a new journal called Harmony, which you can Google and find on science, law, and sustainability. Coming from all walks of life, all different continents, many different communities, but united by the desire to learn about the SDGs. So I know we couldn't get to the question about high school students. We really do have to close now, but I do want to say that there's a lot of agency that students themselves are taking now as well. And there's a lot more that can be done, building on what Houston was saying about the internet and about new directions, that students can kind of become empowered and start their learning journeys themselves. And as professors, we remember that, and we want to be their guides, we want to be their mentors, we want to be their colleagues, their future colleagues. And that's part of the joy of this particular vocation, is that you do often see your students now as professors in their own right elsewhere, or as ministers, or as change makers in their communities, using some of the things you taught them and a whole lot that they discovered themselves to actually make the SDGs a reality globally. So thank you to everyone. Thanks especially to the members of our community of practice who joined us here today to share their methods. Thanks for everyone who have been incredibly active online. And there's a LinkedIn group of educators for the SDGs that Sarah Chiabatoni has just put on the LinkedIn chat. And so I'm going to recommend that everybody maybe check it out if they're interested, and look forward to seeing you next year at the two Together Ensemble sessions. Now we're going to have one for high school students and one for university, I think. And I'm going to get in touch with the Global Youth Council and see if they're willing to run the one for high school students, just because, hey, they're there and they're pretty good at leading their education now. Thank you very, very much.
Great session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye for now.